Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the second episode of our fall series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Ernest Scheyder on his new book, The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives, which details the paradoxes and trade-offs involved in building up the industrial capacity we need to complete the green transition and secure our energy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Ernest is a senior correspondent with Reuters, covering critical minerals and the global energy transition. The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives was published in early 2025 by One Signal Publishers' Atria Books. It was longlisted for the 2024 National Book Award and was named the American Energy Society's Energy Book of the Year. He previously wrote about the U.S. shale revolution, drawing on a 2-year stint based in oil-rich North Dakota, as well as politics and the environment. Find links to the book and to Ernest's other work in our show notes. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to our latest episode of Diplomatic Immunity, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Ernest Scheyder, a Reuters reporter, and he has written a new book called The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. Ernest, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Hey, Kelly, it's great to be with you.
So our normal listeners will know that we have chatted about critical minerals a few times on this podcast because, we understand the importance that they have in today's world and going forward, and the national security aspects they've taken on in recent years. But, I'm excited to talk about this because today we're going to talk a little bit more about the other side of this as well. We're still going to talk about national security stuff, but also where are these coming from and how is it affecting those locales? And I think that's an important thing to always keep in mind with this. So just, to kick it off a little bit, I know you talk about this in the book a little bit, but, what inspired you to write this book, and, what in your background brought you to this topic, and where do you focus? Like, what minerals? I know we have them in the subtitle, but why those minerals?
Yeah, sure thing. So I come at this with a history of covering the oil and gas industry. I joined Reuters more years ago than I care to admit on this podcast. And I joined in New York, and I started writing about oil and gas and the big technological innovation known as fracking that was changing how the United States produced fossil fuels. A few years into that, my boss came to me and said, we got a great offer for you. We want you to move to North Dakota. And at first I thought I lost a bet or something, but it actually turned out to be a great experience. I spent 2 years living there, writing about how fracking was making North Dakota's economy one of the fastest growing in the world. In fact, a stat that I love to share, Kelly, is that my rent in North Dakota was more than double what I was paying in New York City. I think I just show you how this technological innovation really was changing the economy there. But after about 2 years, I became itching for more. And so I moved to Houston, where I wrote about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC. I got to write about oil and how fracking in the United States was really affecting that cartel. But I became really curious about the energy transition. There's been a lot of people that have basically claimed that the oil and gas industry is very, shall we say, harmful when it comes to our global environmental health. And so the answer, many people say, is we have to go green. And I think that means different things to different people. But that question was what animated my shift professionally away from oil and gas coverage and into coverage of mining sort of broadly and critical minerals more specifically. And we're talking about the production of things that would go into batteries or wind turbines or solar panels or electric vehicles. This was around 2018, 2019. And right away, though, I noticed, especially in the United States, or let's call it North America, there was huge opposition in certain places to new mines, to new sources of these critical minerals. People broadly would say, sure, I think it's great that we're going green, whatever that means to you in that particular context, but you can't put a copper mine right here because of indigenous or ecological or environmental reasons. You can't put a lithium mine here because this is an agricultural community and we're not going to be able to grow tomatoes or okra or corn. You can't put a cobalt mine here because you might pollute a waterway that would expand across the North American continent and affect other waterways. And so as I wrote about opposition to each of these projects, I've just asked the logical question in my head. I was like, okay, well, where is the United States hoping to get these critical mineral supplies if we need them to go green? When you look at what the International Energy Agency and other, three-letter organizations out there, governmental organizations talk about, I mean, they all may differ on the specifics of where they see demand going, but they all see demand going up for these critical minerals. And I might differ on the specific critical mineral, but it's going up regardless. And so for me, that question around sourcing, that question around the choice of where we get the sourcing is what animated The War Below and that led to the book. I think that the book's key theme is choice. What are the choices we're willing to make if we want this energy transition? And for me, it's about much more than just how do we look at the climate crisis. It's about all the electronics that we use every single day that are powered by lithium-ion batteries that weren't part of our normal day-to-day lives, say maybe even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And so that really is the animating question that I push into here. So you get to meet a lot of the people that are for and against these projects. You get to physically go to the sites. And I purposely focused most of the book on the United States because I wanted U.S. audiences especially to have to grapple with what is basically a sticky paradox. You can't have green energy without more mining. And I think that's something that especially U.S. audiences have to grapple with more.
Yeah, and there's as our audience knows, we've done reports on critical minerals and stuff and know a bit about this. So there's like, I have so many questions beyond just like the questions that I'm going to ask, and we could dive into this for hours and chat about it. But trying to stick to the key points here myself, so I don't get too in the weeds. But you mentioned, cell phones and things like that, and electric vehicles and stuff. So what is, to give people a better idea of like, critical minerals, it's not like a gram of something that's going into a car battery. It's like massive amounts of these things. And at one point in the book, you talk about the miles of copper wire that are needed for certain things, or that it will take to drive the green economy in the future and stuff. So, where are these things going? And the critical minerals, and we talked about the scale of demand, but where are we getting most of this stuff? I know you focus on the U.S. as well, and we'll get to that in a second. But besides the U.S., where else on the globe are we getting these?
Yeah, so two-part question there. So let me sort of take the first part first. On the demand side, you're right. There are some products that just use gargantuan amount of these critical minerals. The reference to miles and miles of copper, I mean, that's to a Boeing aircraft. And just when you think about all of the literal moving parts in there, many of them made with critical minerals, copper especially, used widely across transportation, around construction, around manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. Copper has been widely used for a very long time. And what we are seeing with the electrification trend, and I would include AI in that as well, just a lot more copper, and the IEA and others have their own sort of estimates on a specific number, but a lot more copper that you got out there. So we see like demand growing out there for lithium. Certainly the lithium-ion battery uses a lot of it. We also know that lithium is used in glasses, greases, and other more industrial applications. And then of course there's the whole periodic table of the elements that used in various different ways out there. So that's sort of roughly on the demand side. We know that we're going to need a lot more of these. On the supply side, when we look across, let's just take the United States right now. There's only one lithium mine. There's very little amount of processing capacity for lithium. The only nickel mine in the United States is going to be depleted in the next 12 to 18 months. It's in Michigan. There's no cobalt facility out there right now. There's one rare earths mine. But as we talk today, there's no large-scale rare earth magnet facility. And that's important because just because you take a rare earth out of the ground doesn't mean you're actually going to be able to do anything with it. You got to process it into a form that can be used to make a magnet. And those magnets take power and turn it into motion. So a great example is the thing that makes your cell phone vibrate is a rare earth magnet. and that was taken out of the ground in China and processed in China and put into a magnet in China. The U.S. right now does not have facilities to do that.
And that's not an easy process, right? I mean, you talked about in the book, like it's a time consuming, like very skill heavy process.
It's extremely skill heavy. It can, depending on what's known as the source rock or the geology, it can be radioactive or sort of have radioactive elements to it that you obviously have to do something with. And so there can be a very environmentally deleterious process to do that. And all of those critical minerals that I just mentioned to you, Kelly, were produced in much larger quantities in the United States 75 or so years ago. The United States just chose to let that specialty, let that focus wither on the vine, if you will. Rare earths is a great example. The United States basically invented the modern rare earths industry in the years after World War II. The Mountain Pass mine in California, which is a key part of the book, it supplied most of the world's rare earths. The color red in color TV, when that became a big thing in the 1960s, was due to europium, which is a rare earth, and that came from that Mountain Pass mine there. But towards the latter part of the 20th century, there was basically less interest across the United States in studying mining as well as funding it. And so we saw a lot more government money go into things like biofuels and other renewable areas. Not to say that that was wrong. It was just less of a focus on mining. Young people, when they would go into university, increasingly studied other areas beyond mining and mining engineering. And so as we sit here today, the U.S. has, I want to say, 13 accredited mining engineering schools. China has hundreds. And you just look at the number of graduates each year, and then I think that sort of underscores where a lot of that technical know-how has left the United States and has gone overseas. So even if there were a desire to move more, you couldn't right now.
Right. We talk a little bit about that in the report we did on this too, is that, over the years, most people, when they think mining in the United States, they think fracking or they think, coal. And it's kind of like a dirty word, mining, right? So people didn't want to go into that, learn that. So we are at a huge skills disadvantage today compared to where we were before because of this, and to the points you just made.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So even if the desire is there, and there is the desire now, what's basically happening in Washington and in other power centers across the country is there's a desire to sort of leapfrog where the technology is nowadays by using advanced robotics, advanced technologies to find new ways basically to skin this cat. And some of that will succeed. It just takes time to develop these new processes. To develop a new way to process rare earths that doesn't have such harmful side effects or harmful byproducts means that there just need to take more time to develop that technology. And I'm not to say that it can't happen. In fact, there's actually some really exciting technologies under development out there, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And the developers acknowledge that.
So, before we get into some of the trade-offs and some of the specific stories that you talk about in your book, we talked about the green energy revolution that's driving a lot of this, but there's also a huge national security aspect to this. And you focus on the United States and our, latent capabilities as far as mining goes, and the efforts by the Trump administration, then the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration again to try to revive some of this. A lot of this is coming out of not just the future of energy, but also national security issues. And the fact that you mentioned the rare earths are mined in China and they're processed in China, and they control like 90% of these rare earth finished products. So this has now become also a national security issue where, China can and has cut off access to these things at different times, some of which go into like F-35 fighter jets and things like that. So talk a little bit about how that's driving the desire to find alternate access to these minerals, and including here in the United States.
Yeah, I think, when I broadly look at the way that, let's just take the two political parties in the United States, I think Republicans focus on the critical minerals issue, maybe more stereotypically broadly through that national security lens. And I think Democrats through maybe more of a climate lens. I'm not to say that it's one or the other. I think President Biden, when he was in office, talked a lot about national security issues. But what we are seeing since January, since the inauguration of President Trump for the second time, perhaps a deeper focus, I think is perhaps the best term, on the national security implications of producing fewer of these critical minerals within our own borders or within allies than meets our demand. And so as a consequence of that, you're starting to see some really interesting partnerships be announced and deployed. A great example is the U.S. Department of Defense in July, roughly 2 months ago, took a big stake in MP Materials, which is the company that owns that Mountain Pass mine, which is the only rare earth mine in the country. And the company is developing a magnet facility in Texas right now that's under construction, under development. And this was the Pentagon basically buying equity in the company and setting a price floor. And that was a tacit acknowledgement by Washington that the price of these vital critical minerals, these rare earths, had been manipulated by Beijing for many years, and it had made it almost uneconomical for parties outside of mainland China to compete. And so by basically saying they're going to guarantee a price floor and also agree to buy some of these companies' product for, I believe it's 10 years, then that basically supports the companies, the government basically saying we are going to make a direct injection into this company, into the economy, and try to support it given what we consider the national security implications. Maybe a more laissez-faire approach would have been to say, okay, well, we'll just go to the open market and see if we can get these as needed. And that might work if you're making motors for, seat motors for a car. But if you're making, as you say earlier, an F-35 fighter jet, you want to be sure that you have access to those critical minerals, to the magnets made from them, in the event of a conflict or sort of other problem. And so, yes, we are seeing more of a full-throated look by Washington into some of these sectors. We have reported in my day job and elsewhere that MP Materials won't be the last. And so we know that that's happening more and more because of these national security concerns. You're also seeing some allies decide to basically invest more or to jump into this space more and more. So the European Union and the United States are talking a lot more with Australia, with some countries in South America that have large supplies of these critical minerals. What's going to be really interesting, though, Kelly, on all of this is we can talk about taking the rock out of the ground, but we still need to process it into something that can be a useful form. So that processing is an area that China has surely realized for decades that if it cornered that market, it could have broad sway over the global economy. And I argue forcefully in the book that that's the reason China's economy is the second largest in the world, is because they realized that processing or that midstream step was so important to its global aspirations. And so, yes, we can talk about mines, and people don't want a mine in their backyard, but they also don't want a giant smelter right next door. And so that's got to be a huge part right now. That's directly linked to these national security concerns that politicians in Washington and Brussels and Canberra and Ottawa and elsewhere are trying to address right now.
So let's look at this from a historical perspective for a minute. And, you've got a unique perspective because you covered oil. And obviously for the 20th century was sort of marked by a scramble for fossil fuels and getting access to that. And there's been comparisons to critical minerals as sort of the new fossil fuel and sort of the geopolitical tensions that went around that for decades. Do you find that to be a useful comparison, or is that a false analogy?
I do find it to be a helpful comparison. And the reason that I do is I think the average person, when they think about energy sort of writ large, maybe their mind recoils, or maybe they just think about it in the lens of what gasoline costs them when they fill up their tank, or if they've got a house, what heating oil might cost. And I think that is a good comparison point. But what I would see is that I do see some more technical similarities, but also a few differences. And here's what I mean by that. There are key learnings from the 20th century related to oil and gas and how it proliferated and really helped define the economy of the 20th century. And not all of them are good. Certainly, we got climate change out of the proliferation of oil and gas. That is something we're dealing with here today in the year 2025. We got OPEC, one of the world's largest cartels that controls roughly a third of fossil fuel production. certainly there was armed conflicts tied to where different countries hoped to get petroleum supplies. We had war basically over this. And so I think that there can be some key learnings from that as we look to this expansion of critical mineral production and demand in the 21st century that can help guide us. Beyond that, though, I do see a lot of differences. And the differences that I see are reflected, I think, in the complexities of the critical mineral supply chain. So oil and natural gas, obviously both fossil fuels, taken out of the ground in similar ways, depending on the deposit where you are in. But with critical minerals, I mean, there's, depending on what you need and where it is and how you plan to use it and refine it, you could have dozens and dozens of different ways to produce these things. How you produce lithium is vastly different than how you produce copper, is vastly different than how you produce rare earths. And all of those are going to require technical know-how and the money to get it out of the ground and then to turn it into something that can be used to make your cell phone, just to take one average product. So it's that complexity, I think, that really, really differentiates it from the oil and gas economy of the 20th century. Whereas that was, I'm not going to say it was not complex. It is a complex space, but the critical mineral space is that much more complex. When we think about it from a policy perspective, we have to approach it recognizing that complexity is there. And so perhaps some of the old ways of thinking about energy writ large need to be updated for this new 21st century approach.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering, too, that the infrastructure for oil and gas took decades to make as well. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. So let's dive into the book a little bit more as far as sort of the specifics of the book. And, you mentioned this already a little bit, but dive into this a little bit more for us on the exploration that you did in your reporting and in the book on that tension between fighting climate change or for national security purposes, whatever your purpose is for, and the environmental impact of this mining. What is that sort of trade-off that you get right to in your book?
Yeah. So each chapter in the book explores a specific proposed project, most of which are in the United States. And I wanted each chapter to sort of be reflective of what I consider key themes that the reader should be debating. And so you have a chapter that looks at indigenous rights versus copper for the climate transition, local landowner rights, ecological preservation. But the narrative spine of the book, which comprises roughly 3 chapters in the narrative, is the story of this rare flower found nowhere else on the planet except for this one small spot in Nevada, roughly 200 miles north of Las Vegas. This flower is known as Team's buckwheat, and for reasons that are still very unclear to botanists, it loves this soil that is rich in lithium. And so right at the beginning of the book, you get to learn about the gentleman that discovered this flower for the first time in the 1980s. And then you get to meet the chairman of the company that would like to develop this lithium into a mine. And for this person, he comes at it from an oil and gas background. And for him, developing a lithium project is sort of quasi-religious. It's sort of his way of making penance for producing oil and gas earlier in his career. And so he really sees this as his raison d'etre, his motivating factor for helping leave the planet greener than the one that he found. Then you also meet a gentleman who's a conservationist who says, well, hey, if you develop this mine, wouldn't this flower go extinct? This flower found nowhere else on that planet. And climate change, fighting climate change certainly is important. But what about biodiversity protection? If we let this flower go extinct, what's next? Is it a large tree? Is it a forest? Is it a whole entire species of animal? And so for him, the loss of one species is a non-negotiable compared to the importance of protecting biodiversity. And it's such a fascinating question that I wanted to explore. And that's why I made it, as I say, the narrative spine of this book here, because I wanted readers to say, okay, well, it might seem easy on the outset to be like, sure, let the flower go extinct. We need lithium. But is that the right answer, or should we be thinking through this more? Or, if we did nothing, would the flower go extinct due to climate change? And so should we make climate the absolute importance here? And both men, it was my honor really to profile both of their perspectives and to sort of see the site through their eyes, and also to see it through regulators. And you get to discover during the course of the book how sometimes Washington and other government agencies don't really speak with one voice. One agency in Washington is deciding whether or not to declare the flower an endangered species, whereas another part of the federal government is deciding whether to give a gargantuan loan to the project to produce domestic lithium. They seem to be at cross purposes there, but you discover in the narrative what actually happens in the end. And so for me, that perfectly crystallized what I wanted to bring to the reader here. And I purposely, I should say, Kelly, don't put my opinion in the books, whether it's about this team's buckwheat flower or sort of the larger issue more broadly, because I wanted the reader to be, forced really to make these choices or to have these conversations. And I really hope that the book is part of broader conversations about where and how we want to get these building blocks for the products we're increasingly using every single day.
Yeah, and it was interesting reading this too, because even though I've done quite a bit of research on critical minerals and we've talked about ESGs and environmental sustainability and everything with mining them in our report, and indigenous rights we talked a lot about in our report. This brought it home in a new way for me, the way that you sort of chronicled all these different sides, and it really hits home. We talked about the complex nature of the mining and the processing, but it's also such a complex issue because there's so many different players that are coming in at this from different sides. And like you said, it's do we get, lose a flower that only grows in this one certain area and it's gone forever? Do we risk polluting a river that feeds into a town and it could affect all these people? Would I want a smelter that I could see that's 200 yards away from my backyard? Like all these different things. Like these are real concerns that you have to deal with. And it also puts in highlights very starkly why it takes upwards of 10 years to get a mine approved and functioning in the United States because of all of this that's going on. And there's all kinds of stories in the book, and I highly recommend folks grabbing this because it is so interesting and touches on a lot of these what seem to be almost impossible trade-offs that people have to make on this. But you went all over the country, and we'll just focus on the U.S. here. What can you give us another one or two of the sort of memorable stories that really kind of stuck with you? I know this is a tough one because there's a lot in the book, and you lived and breathed this, but yeah.
So for about 3 or 4 chapters in the book, it follows me as I drive through much of the western part of the United States. And first off, Western United States, amazing. I just spend a lot of time outdoors just by virtue of my job. That sort of memory sticks out to me of spending multiple weeks driving through the Western United States for this book project. It was amazing. I did have occasion to go to the Thacker Pass Lithium mine site, which is under construction now as we speak, but at the time was sort of just empty prairie lands controlled by the U.S. government. And there was a gentleman who strongly opposed the potential development of the mine at the time. And I went up there and I actually camped out at the site with him and got to see it through his eyes. And we hiked around the site for many, many, many hours. It's a huge area. And but this soil is so lithium rich, it's going to end up being one of the largest lithium mines in the world, the largest certainly in the Western Hemisphere when it is built. And I basically camped out there for 2 days with him and got to see the site, as I say, through his eyes. And it was beautiful. It was a great opportunity to sort of see that spot and to see the potential of it, and also to talk to him about why he opposed it. I really worked hard in this narrative to humanize everyone, to not to patronize him or turn him into a caricature, or anyone really for that matter. If you, the reader, come to your own conclusions about these people based on what I consider sort of neutral descriptions of them, that's certainly your right. But I wanted to honor who these people are and sort of say that their ideas have value. And this gentleman advocates for a deindustrialization of our entire global economy. His way of fighting climate change is to stop using electronics, to stop using modern conveniences, including electric cars, and to basically return to an agrarian way of life. Yes, he does use electronics, but they're older, and he doesn't plan on buying new ones. No, he doesn't plan on having children because he considers that harmful to the planet. And I wanted to paint him respectfully, and I think I did so in that. And I also got to experience a pretty beautiful part of our country. And so being able to sort of balance those in that chapter was something that was a little tricky, but I was happy with the end results and was glad to put it out there for the world.
Yeah, and I do think you did a great job of balancing this stuff because it does, everybody's going to go into this with their own preconceived notions on what we should do based on sort of what they think is important. But even with that, I think it enlightens people to think more about the other side, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. And it just makes you think. And I think you're referring to are you referring to the Native American?
Thacker Pass. Yeah, no, that's the Thacker Pass project. Yeah, that's on the Nevada or Oregon border.
Yeah. That's the religious site.
That does have Native American opposition. Several projects do have some Native American opposition. That is one, as well as the Thacker Pass project had opposition from some ranchers and others concerned about water usage and what is a particularly arid part of Nevada. Yeah.
Yeah, and just that the notion of the religious aspect of things that I hadn't thought about as much, and going into it and being like, well, there's a handful of Native Americans that are against this because it has religious implications, but then thinking about it in terms of like, well, what if this was a massive Christian religious site? Like, I feel like then it would be a no-brainer that we wouldn't mine there, and like, but what's the difference at the end of the day? You're either trampling on somebody's religious rights or you're not. And like thinking of it in those terms makes this a lot more difficult. And just, the mine in Minnesota sticks out as well. And like that wilderness area up there that is so dependent on the one hand on the outdoor nature and the people that come up and go camping and hiking and boating and fishing. And then on the other side, they're sitting on top of all these critical minerals. And how do you, weigh those trade-offs, and how much can you really know that it's not going to affect things from an environmental standpoint? And, just conversations that need to be had. And in light of that, I know you go into this with, no preconceived notions and just try to do the reporting with in an objective way. But what were some of the most difficult conversations you had? Not just because you were, in a argument with someone, but because I don't think you were, but just like, that were just difficult to hear and sort of comprehend in this whole process.
First off, I want to say that everyone that gave their time, I was extremely thankful. And people don't have to talk to me or any journalist for that matter. But everyone that I talked to knew what I was trying to do and trying to respectfully paint what was a really complex area. One of the most complex ones did involve the Resolution Copper Project, which is in Arizona, roughly an hour east of Phoenix. And this is a project that, if it is developed, would cause a crater that would destroy a site where the San Carlos Apache people worship their deities. And it was my honor to spend some time at that site where several members of a group known as Apache Stronghold, which is comprised of the San Carlos Apache and their allies, have been camped out for a good chunk of time. You really get a sense of why they oppose the project by going there, by spending time with them, by, seeing the site through their eyes. And there's nothing really quite like going there. And so for me, I don't know if I would characterize that as difficult, but I would say that it was sort of essential and important for the narrative to go there. And I think too often, you're right, to your point, Kelly, that some people might just be like, oh, we need copper or we need this other critical mineral. Let's just develop this. but sometimes those issues aren't as black and white as we might assume. And I think recognizing that there are people on all sides of these complex issues, and we need to be having broad conversations about where and how we want to get these critical minerals. And by sort of just showing up to a store and expecting the products made with those critical minerals to be there, I think is an extremely short-sighted point of view that is slowly going away. I think people are slowly starting to get these things into the common parlance more and more. And so we'll see what time brings. But I would say the Resolution Copper was, a fascinating experience, my honor to cover it. And that's the reason why I made it the longest chapter in the book, because I think it's the most complex and intractable issue. And it's still in the courts as we sit here today.
Yeah. And you brought up, folks like us going to the store and buying products, whether it's a cell phone or a computer or an electric car or whatever. And it made me think too that you mentioned like thinking more about where we get these things, not just like buying an electric car and thinking like, oh, I'm doing my part for the environment and climate and everything. But then, are we negating that by the fact that it's mined and stuff's pulled out of the DRC and there's, children forced to mine this and there's a war going on to do that and stuff like that. So, and I know that they've done things with diamonds and things like that now to know that they're reliably sourced, and there's fair trade stuff and all that kind of stuff. But are there movements like that with critical minerals?
The short answer is yes, but it's going to take a lot more from the average consumer like me and you and everyone else to push for it. A great example that I actually made a whole chapter in the book is about leaf blowers. And that might sound really sort of silly or innocuous, but I wanted to take a common household appliance that historically was powered by fossil fuels, but increasingly is powered by lithium-ion batteries. And so there's a whole world about leaf blowers. In fact, I would encourage your audience, if you want a good chuckle, Google Cate Blanchett leaf blowers. The actress feels very passionately about leaf blowers. So I'll let the Google speak for her. But in any event, many municipalities across the world are outlawing leaf blowers powered by fossil fuels. They're illegal in Washington, D.C. They're being phased out in Brussels and California and other places. And so the answer, people say, is get a leaf blower powered by a lithium-ion battery. And so you're thinking, great, like I'm doing a really good thing for the planet. And so that's what I did when I was writing this book. I bought one because I had a backyard and I was mowing it and I was like, great, I'll do it, very on brand. But because I'm writing this book, that led me into some pretty deep questions about supply chain. I was like, okay, well, if getting a leaf blower powered by a lithium-ion battery is better for the planet, where did the lithium come from? Where did it come out of the ground in northern Chile or parts of China or Australia? If it came out of the ground in Australia, did it go across the Pacific Ocean 2 or 3 times? What was the carbon footprint of that? Did the cobalt in that lithium-ion battery get taken out of the ground by a 7-year-old in the Congo? Which happens, sadly, far more frequently than we would like. Did the copper come out of the ground in Peru, where we have Peruvian farmers that have strongly opposed copper mining in Peru, which is one of the world's largest producers of that metal? And so when these big copper trucks come by, they kick up a lot of dust that basically destroys these farmers' crops. And so you're having a harmful effect on your neighbors. What social responsibility did that mining company feel in order to remunerate to ameliorate that potential damage to those farmers? These are all really complex questions. And I tried, Kelly. I mean, I have a lot of resources at my disposal, and I try to figure out where all the critical minerals in that leaf blower came from. And I came up with no answers. And so that's just for my basic leaf blower that I use in my backyard. Now think about all the other electronics that are out there. You can see how much of a black hole for information that this is. And so what would it look like for us as consumers to demand more transparency from the manufacturers that build the products that we use every single day? We sort of do this already in other industries. We don't even realize it. We do it in clothing. People have put a lot of pressure on clothing manufacturers not to use sweatshops. And thankfully, increasingly, there are far fewer instances of sweatshops being used. People put it on coffee companies. Starbucks was pressured about 10 or 15 years ago to pay their Ethiopian coffee farmers a living wage, due in part to pressure from average consumers. So what would it look like to tell an electric vehicle manufacturer or a leaf blower manufacturer that, hey, if you want us to buy your product, we need to know that you're actually caring for the planet with the manufacturing and the sourcing of the materials here. And I think the more that stuff happens, the better off we're going to be, because we can't just sort of blindly move forward into this new economy and expecting everything to be better, because green energy economy means wildly different things to different people. But if at its core, it's a desire to improve the health of the planet and to make our lives more efficient and better, well, then we better hold the entire industry to account.
Yeah, that chapter was fascinating. It definitely made me look at my electric lawnmower and leaf blower in a new light, because I bought those thinking like I'm doing something good and I'm not going to, get a gas lawnmower and things like this. And yeah, definitely, puts things in new perspective. But all right, I'll get you out of here on this. I know we've talked a lot about sort of key takeaways and things like that, but just, to reiterate for our listeners, what are, the one or two things you hope people walk away from this book thinking, or what new appreciation do you want them to have?
Yeah, so two things that I would say I would love for people to take away from the book. The first thing is this idea of choice. We really need to be thinking through these tough choices around where and how we want mines in our country and really in places across the globe. And in addition to that, where do we want these processing facilities? Critical minerals has become the defining issue of the 21st century global economy. Whoever controls the production and processing of lithium and copper and cobalt and all these other critical minerals will control the 21st century, the way that control of oil defined the 20th century. And so it really behooves us to be thinking through these tough choices. They've got to be made. Related to that, I would say the second point is having discussions amongst yourselves, but also with your elected officials, with your manufacturers out there. I mean, what would it look like to call up your member of Congress and say, I want to talk about mining policy? Might sound boring and it might sound simplistic, but Kelly, the law that governs hard rock mining in the United States has been around since 1872. It's not really been changed that much. That's when Ulysses S. Grant was president. Now, I didn't know Grant, but I know that he never made a phone call on an iPhone. He never had a computer. He never had a Tesla. He never had an electric leaf blower. And so, the law is just written for a different time. And most of the mineral resources in the United States are in the West. And so, what would it look like to have an informed conversation with our members of Congress and other elected officials about these issues? I mean, I think key discussions need to be had, and I hope that the book is part of sparking those broader discussions.
Yeah, and I think now's as good a time as any to do it, because as we've mentioned, this is more front and center on both Democrats and Republicans, maybe not for all of the same exact reasons, but it is something where a congressman or somebody from their staff is now going to take a phone call and listen more intently on mining issues than they would have 10 or 15 years ago. So
Exactly.
Well, Ernest, thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending the time with us today. And once again, I encourage folks to go out and take a look at The War Below. I thought it was great and a timely read.
Awesome. Great to be with you, Kelly. Have a great day.
Thanks to Ernest for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Community. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdallah Nassif. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.